The lights of Madrid shone brightly that cold night, but Lucas barely noticed them as he raced through the narrow, winding streets. His heart pounded, the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the deserted alleys. Fear pulsed through his veins, each breath a cruel reminder that he was being hunted. He didn't know exactly who or what was after him, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. It all started a few hours earlier when he left work in the city center. He had been walking calmly, lost in thought, when he noticed a dark figure trailing him from a distance. At first, he thought it was just paranoia, but he was soon convinced otherwise when the footsteps grew louder and the stares more insistent. Lucas turned a corner into a less busy street. His lungs burned, and the icy air sliced through his throat. He needed to find a place to hide, but where? The tall buildings and old facades of the city offered no refuge, and every shadow seemed to conceal something even more terrifying. He ran into a narrow passage, an alley snaking between two old buildings. His pursuers, whoever they were, seemed to know the terrain well, as they quickly found him again. Lucas felt their presence drawing closer, a chill running down his spine. Fear drove him on, and he knew that stopping was not an option. The sound of distorted laughter and eerie whispers began to fill the air, as if the night itself were conspiring against him. Lucas glanced back, his eyes wide trying to make out figures in the shadows. But the darkness seemed to take shape, molding into horrific silhouettes that relentlessly pursued him. Desperate, Lucas spotted a small bar, still open despite the late hour. The yellowish light escaping through the dirty windows seemed like a beacon of hope. He ran toward the door, his legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. He pushed the door open with force and stumbled inside, breathless. The bar was nearly empty, except for a few solitary patrons and the bartender who was cleaning glasses with a bored expression. Lucas staggered to the counter, trying to catch his breath and find words to describe the terror he felt. The bartender looked up, surprised by Lucas's sudden entrance. "Are you all right, buddy?" he asked, with a slight Castilian accent. Lucas shook his head, unable to respond immediately. He felt a chill at the back of his neck, as if the shadows had followed him inside. He looked around, his eyes still wide with fear. He knew this was just the beginning of many terrifying nights he would face in Madrid. Lucas barely had time to calm down in the bar before realizing it wouldn't be safe for long. His pursuers wouldn't take long to find him there. He needed to keep moving. After quickly thanking the bartender, he slipped out the back door, immersing himself once again in the cold Madrid night. Driven by an almost primal instinct, Lucas headed towards La Latina, a neighborhood known for its labyrinth of narrow streets and ancient buildings that seemed to whisper stories of the past. The cobblestones echoed with his hurried footsteps as he ventured through alleys and passages known to few tourists. The labyrinth of La Latina could be his refuge, or his downfall. The distant sound of flamenco music and lively conversations in nearby bars contrasted sharply with the tension he felt. The night was alive, but Lucas moved like a ghost, avoiding the lights and staying in the shadows. In one of the narrowest streets, he found a semi-open door with stairs leading down to a basement. It looked like an improvised hiding place, but any spot away from prying eyes was a relief. Descending carefully, he found himself in an old stone cellar, filled with dusty barrels and boxes. The smell of mold and dampness was strong, but Lucas preferred this to the threat outside. He hid behind a stack of boxes, trying to regulate his breathing and listen for any signs of his pursuers. The darkness was nearly complete, except for a sliver of light coming through the slightly open door, casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps descending the stairs made him freeze. Lucas held his breath, his senses on high alert. A man entered, holding a small flashlight. The beam of light swept across the cellar, briefly illuminating Lucas's face before moving to another corner. The man seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Moments dragged on in oppressive silence until the man turned and ascended the stairs, leaving the cellar in darkness once more. Lucas let out a sigh of relief but knew he wasn't safe yet. He needed to keep moving. He emerged from his hiding spot carefully, climbing back to the streets of La Latina. This time, he opted to blend in with the crowd. The main square of the neighborhood was bustling with people, food stalls, and street performers. Lucas lost himself among the groups, trying to appear as normal as possible while keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. As he walked through the square, a hooded figure caught his attention. The person seemed to be watching everything from a distance, motionless like a statue. Lucas felt a shiver but tried to ignore it and move away. However, something inside him told him that the figure was there because of him. The chase wasn't over, and the streets of La Latina would only be the beginning of a deadly game of cat and mouse. With his heart still racing, Lucas ducked into a small cafe, seeking momentarily the warmth and security of the bustling environment. Sitting in a corner, he watched the hooded figure outside, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. He knew he needed to find out who was after him and why, but the night was still young, and the dangers of Madrid were just beginning to reveal themselves. Lucas tried to find some comfort in the small cafe in La Latina, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him alone. Even with the lively conversations around him and the smell of fresh coffee filling the air, he knew he had to stay alert. His eyes scanned the surroundings, always on the lookout for the hooded figure he had seen in the square. After a few minutes, he quickly paid the bill and left the cafe, blending back into the crowd. The streets of La Latina were becoming increasingly crowded, with tourists and locals enjoying the night. Lucas decided to head towards the Manzanares River, hoping to find some relief by the riverbanks where the flow of people would be lighter. As he walked, he noticed that the night was quieter than usual. The sound of footsteps echoed off the cobblestone streets, creating an unsettling melody. Suddenly, Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He stopped, trying to understand what was wrong. That's when he saw it, a translucent figure, almost imperceptible, standing at the end of the street. Its empty eyes seemed to be fixed directly on him. Lucas blinked several times, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained there, motionless and spectral. Panic took over, and he started running, trying to get away from the apparition. But the faster he ran, the more he felt the dark presence closing in around him. It was as if the city itself were conspiring against him. Reaching the Manzanares River, Lucas stopped to catch his breath. The moon reflected off the dark waters, creating a serene scene that contrasted sharply with the chaos in his mind. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, but logic failed to calm him. That's when he heard a whisper. "Lucas," the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was cold and empty, like the wind blowing over the water. Lucas spun around quickly, but he saw no one. His heart was pounding so fast that he felt he might faint at any moment. He knew he needed to find a safe place, but where could he go? The city seemed full of lurking shadows and dangers. Walking along the river, he found a small bridge leading to a less illuminated area. He thought that maybe, in the darkness, he could hide better. As he crossed the bridge, however, he saw the spectral figure again, this time much closer. Its empty eyes were an abyss of darkness, and its ghostly hand seemed to reach out towards him. Lucas recoiled, but there was nowhere to run. The figure advanced slowly, each step a silent torment. Then a familiar voice echoed in Lucas's mind, a memory from his childhood. "Don't be afraid of what can't touch you, my son." It was his mother's voice, offering a moment of clarity amid the chaos. Taking a deep breath, Lucas closed his eyes and repeated to himself that it wasn't real. When he opened his eyes again, the figure had vanished, like a nightmare dissipated by the light of dawn. He felt a momentary relief, but he knew it wouldn't be the last time he encountered the inexplicable. The streets of Madrid held ancient secrets, and he was just beginning to uncover them. With the spectral figure gone, Lucas continued walking through the streets of Madrid, feeling the tension ease just a little. He knew he needed to find out more about what was happening and, perhaps, understand why he was being pursued. The memories of the hooded figure and the unsettling whispers were still fresh in his mind, and he decided that the best way to find answers was to investigate the older, less-known parts of the city. Lucas recalled an old bookstore in the Malasana neighborhood, famous for its rare books and ancient manuscripts. He believed that if there were any clues about what was happening, he might find them there. Upon arrival, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cozy space, greeted by the smell of aged paper like an old friend. The bookseller, an elderly man with thick glasses and a white beard, looked up from a dusty volume and regarded Lucas with curiosity. "Can I help you, young man?" he asked, with a rough yet gentle voice. Lucas briefly explained what was happening, not going into too much detail to avoid seeming crazy. The old bookseller listened attentively, his eyes sparkling with an interest that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "You're dealing with something very old, my dear," the bookseller said, rising slowly. "Follow me." He led Lucas to the back of the bookstore, where shelves of ancient books formed a labyrinth of knowledge. In a small, dimly lit room, the bookseller pulled a large, heavy tome from a high shelf. The book looked centuries old, with a worn leather cover and pages yellowed with age. "This is a record of secret societies and cults that have operated in Madrid," the bookseller explained, carefully opening the book. "There's one cult in particular that might be linked to what you've seen." Lucas looked at the pages, reading about the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura, an ancient cult that believed in communion with spirits and supernatural entities. It was said that they used macabre rituals to summon these forces, seeking forbidden power and knowledge. The illustrations showed hooded figures very similar to those Lucas had seen, and strange symbols he couldn't understand. This cult used hidden locations throughout the city for their rituals, the bookseller continued. Catacombs, abandoned churches, any place where they could operate without being discovered. They say some of their members are still around, keeping the old practices alive. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He thanked the bookseller and left the bookstore, now with a clearer direction. If the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura still existed, he needed to find its members and understand what they wanted from him. Following the clues in the book, Lucas went to an old abandoned church, hidden among the modern buildings of Madrid. The Gothic structure, with its broken towers and stained glass windows, seemed like a monument to the city's dark past. As he entered, the cold and damp atmosphere immediately enveloped him. Walking through the dark corridors, he found an altar covered in strange symbols, identical to those he had seen in the book. The air felt heavy, almost tangible, and Lucas sensed that he was not alone. A shadow moved at the corner of his eye, and he quickly turned, but saw no one. Suddenly, a low, whispering voice filled the space. "You shouldn't be here." Lucas felt his heart race, but decided to confront the unknown. "Who's there?" His voice echoed in the empty church. A figure emerged from the shadows, hooded and with a cold, empty gaze. "You have awakened forces you don't understand," said the figure, slowly advancing. The Hermandad does not forget. And it does not forgive. Lucas tried to stay calm, but he knew he was in grave danger. He needed to learn more, and quickly, before it was too late. The shadows of Madrid were closing in around him, and the mystery of the hidden cult was just the beginning of a much larger nightmare. Leaving the abandoned church was a momentary relief for Lucas, but he knew that safety was only a temporary illusion. The streets of Madrid, usually familiar and welcoming, now seemed full of invisible dangers. The hooded figures and whispers about the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura continued to haunt him, but he knew he had to keep going. Determined to seek more information, Lucas turned to an old friend who worked as an investigative journalist. Pedro had always had a knack for uncovering hidden secrets, and Lucas hoped he could shed some light on the sinister events unfolding. They met in a discreet bar, tucked away in a quieter part of the city. Pedro, with his disheveled hair and watchful eyes, listened to Lucas's story with growing concern. "This is serious, Lucas," Pedro said, shuffling through his papers. "I've received some tips about recent disappearances, and there are rumors about a killer wearing a mask. They say he's connected to the Hermandad." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The idea of a masked killer on the loose, linked to the cult, made the situation even more terrifying. "I need to find this killer, Pedro. Maybe he has the answers I'm looking for." Pedro hesitated but knew Lucas was determined. "I've heard about a clandestine meeting in the basement of the Mercado de San Miguel. It's dangerous, but it might be your chance." Lucas thanked Pedro and headed to the market. The area was relatively busy, with tourists and locals enjoying the culinary delights. However, he was focused on one specific point, a hidden entrance leading to the underground tunnels. The entrance was an old trapdoor, concealed under a pile of crates. Lucas descended cautiously, finding himself in a dark, damp tunnel, illuminated only by scattered torches. The air was heavy and smelled of earth and mold. Each step echoed off the narrow walls, increasing his sense of claustrophobia. As he moved forward, he heard low, whispering voices. He approached carefully, peeking around a stone wall. He saw a group of hooded figures gathered in a circle, chanting in an unknown language. In the center, a tall, thin man wore a frightening mask, sculpted to look like a grotesque, distorted face. Lucas recognized the killer from Pedro's description. The man held a ritualistic dagger, shimmering in the torchlight. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and the masked killer raised his head, as if sensing Lucas's presence. A deadly silence filled the tunnel, and all eyes turned towards him. Sensing imminent danger, Lucas tried to retreat, but a firm hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him into the circle. The masked killer approached slowly, each step echoing in the silence. "You are brave," he said, his voice distorted by the mask. "But bravery without knowledge is suicide." Lucas tried to fight back, but was quickly subdued by the cult members. The masked killer brought the dagger close to his face, his eyes glowing behind the grotesque mask. "You came looking for answers, didn't you?" he asked, with a tone almost amused. "Well, you'll find the answers in death." Before Lucas could react, he was bound and taken to a dark room, isolated from the rest of the tunnels. The masked killer and his followers left him there, trapped and vulnerable. As he struggled against the ropes, Lucas heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure entered. It was Pedro, with an urgent expression. "Let's go, before they come back," he whispered, quickly cutting the ropes. Lucas and Pedro ran through the tunnels, each step a battle against fear and despair. The sound of footsteps behind them indicated that the cult members were on their trail. Adrenaline fueled their escape, but the terror of being caught pursued them relentlessly. They emerged back into the market, breathless and sweating but alive. Lucas knew that the encounter with the masked killer was only the beginning of a new phase of terror and mystery. The Hermandad de la Noche Oscura was closer than he had imagined, and the deadly game was far from over. After their frantic escape from the tunnels under Mercado de San Miguel, Lucas and Pedro knew they needed to find a safe place to regroup and come up with a plan. They decided to hide out in Pedro's apartment, a modest place away from the city center where they hoped the Hermandad wouldn't easily find them. As they recovered, Pedro revealed to Lucas that he had uncovered something disturbing in his research. The royal palace of Madrid harbored ancient and dark secrets linked to the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura. Old documents suggested the existence of a network of tunnels and subterranean chambers beneath the palace, used by the cult for secret rituals and clandestine meetings. If there were answers, they would likely be found there. Despite the danger, Lucas felt this was the best lead they had. With Pedro's help, he infiltrated the royal palace at night when security was less strict. They used a service entrance accessible through a small courtyard at the back of the palace and began descending a narrow staircase that led to an underground level seldom seen. The air was heavy and damp, and the stone walls bore marks of a forgotten past. Equipped with flashlights, Lucas and Pedro moved cautiously through narrow corridors, alert to any sounds or movements. Every step echoed off the walls, heightening their sense of claustrophobia. After a few minutes of walking, they came upon a reinforced wooden door with old metal fittings. Opening it revealed a vast subterranean chamber, illuminated by candles arranged in circles. The environment was oppressive, with esoteric symbols drawn on the floor and walls, some of which Lucas recognized from the book in the bookstore. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, upon which lay an ancient book bound in leather and secured with a metal latch. Pedro approached cautiously, examining the object. "This must be the Hermandad's grimoire," Pedro said, touching the latch. "If we can open it, we might uncover the secrets of the cult." Lucas scanned the room for anything that could help. He then noticed a small key hanging on the wall, camouflaged among other ancient artifacts. He took it and handed it to Pedro, who quickly unlocked the grimoire. The pages were filled with symbols and writings in an ancient language. What caught Lucas's attention was a detailed illustration of a ritual that seemed to describe the invocation of supernatural entities. In the center of the drawing, a hooded figure held the same ritualistic dagger he had seen with the masked killer. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Lucas and Pedro exchanged panicked glances. There was no time to escape unnoticed, they needed to hide. They found a small opening in the wall, partially covered by debris, and squeezed inside, trying to control their breathing. The main chamber filled with murmurs as hooded figures entered, carrying torches and chanting. Among them, Lucas recognized the masked killer, his intimidating presence dominating the scene. The cult members began preparing the altar for a ritual, placing strange objects around the open grimoire. The masked killer raised the dagger, starting to chant words in a guttural, ancient language. The atmosphere grew dense, almost suffocating, and Lucas felt a tingling on his skin as if something invisible was approaching. Suddenly, a dense, amorphous shadow began to form in the center of the circle, growing and pulsing with malevolent energy. Pedro grabbed Lucas's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here, now," he whispered urgently. As the chanting intensified, Lucas and Pedro squeezed through the opening, trying to make as little noise as possible. They moved carefully but knew they had to be quick. Just as they were almost out, Lucas accidentally kicked a stone, which clattered loudly across the floor. The sound cut through the air, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The masked killer turned, his eyes blazing with fury and suspicion. "Someone's here!" he shouted. Without wasting any more time, Lucas and Pedro ran through the dark corridors, hearing the hurried footsteps and shouts of the cult members behind them. Adrenaline fueled their escape, but the fear of being captured pushed them even faster. They finally reached the staircase leading back to the surface. They climbed quickly, and as they emerged into the palace courtyard, they felt the cool night air fill their lungs. Without looking back, they fled from the royal palace, aware that they had uncovered only a small part of the mystery. The dark secrets of Madrid were beginning to reveal themselves, and the worst was yet to come. After their desperate escape from the royal palace, Lucas and Pedro knew they were racing against time. The secrets they had uncovered so far suggested that the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura was about to perform a ritual of catastrophic proportions. They needed to find out more, and quickly. Pedro recalled a contact of his, a historian specializing in cults and sects, who might provide more information about the Hermandad. The man, named Javier, lived in seclusion and worked in a small, forgotten crypt beneath the Basilica of San Isidro. They decided to seek him out, hoping he could shed some light on the events they were facing. The basilica, with its imposing towers and baroque facade, seemed a bastion of peace and tranquility, but Lucas and Pedro knew appearances could be deceiving. As they descended into the crypt, they were greeted by Javier, a middle-aged man with an intense focus and eyes that seemed to see beyond the present. "Pedro, good to see you," Javier said with a nod. "And you must be Lucas. I've heard of you. Please, come in." The crypt was a maze of narrow corridors and rooms filled with ancient documents, relics, and religious artifacts. Javier led them to a larger room where several candles cast a flickering light over scattered papers on a table. "What have you found?" Javier asked as Pedro and Lucas recounted their discoveries at the royal palace. Javier listened intently, his face growing darker with each word. "The Hermandad is more active than I thought," he finally said. "And if they're planning a major ritual, we need to stop them. This grimoire you found describes a ritual for summoning an ancient entity, a force they believe they can control." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The images in the grimoire began to make sense, but the terror of what the Hermandad was trying to achieve was almost unimaginable. "And where do they plan to perform this ritual?" Lucas asked, trying to stay calm. Javier pulled out an old map of Madrid and spread it out on the table. "There's a place, an ancient underground sanctuary known only to a few. It lies deep beneath the city, below the crypt of San Isidro. The Hermandad believes this place has a direct connection to the spiritual underworld." Pedro looked at Lucas, the gravity of the situation reflected in his eyes. "We need to go there, now," Pedro said firmly. Javier agreed but warned. "It's dangerous. They'll be prepared. And the forces they're trying to summon are older and more powerful than we can imagine." Determined, Lucas led the way through the depths of the crypt. They passed through increasingly narrow and dark corridors, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with every step. Finally, they reached a hidden passage blocked by a stone door with carved symbols that faintly glowed in the candlelight. Javier murmured an ancient prayer and touched the symbols, causing the door to creak open. The air inside the sanctuary was icy, and Lucas felt a dark presence enveloping them. The room before them was vast, with ancient pillars and an altar at the center. Hooded figures were positioned around it, chanting in unison. On the altar, the masked killer raised the dagger, about to complete the ritual. "No!" Lucas shouted, advancing. The Hermandad members turned, startled, but quickly reacted. A fierce fight broke out, with Lucas, Pedro, and Javier facing off against the cult followers. The battle was chaotic, with shouts and echoes reverberating off the ancient walls. Lucas managed to reach the altar and confronted the masked killer. The fight was intense, with blows exchanged amid the chaos. Finally, with a desperate effort, Lucas disarmed the killer and knocked him down. But before they could celebrate their victory, the ground began to tremble. The energy from the interrupted ritual was spiraling out of control, and a colossal shadow began to emerge from the center of the altar, an entity of pure darkness and malevolence. Lucas felt despair grow, but Javier, with his deep knowledge and brave heart, began to recite ancient banishment words. The entity roared, a primordial force of hatred and pain, but gradually, Javier's chants began to take effect. With one final, piercing scream, the entity was sucked back into the depths from which it came, and the sanctuary fell silent. Lucas, Pedro, and Javier stood there, breathless and shaken but alive. They had stopped the Hermandad, at least for now. But they knew the battle was far from over. After the intense battle in the underground sanctuary, Lucas, Pedro, and Javier knew they couldn't afford to rest. The forces of the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura were still on the move, and their intentions were more sinister than they had ever imagined. It was crucial to gather all possible allies and prepare for the final confrontation. Lucas suggested meeting with other survivors and people who might be willing to help. Pedro recalled some old contacts, people who had faced the supernatural before and could bring valuable knowledge and strength to the fight. They decided to gather in a safe and discreet location, away from the Hermandad's watchful eyes. The chosen location was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Madrid. It was spacious and isolated, perfect for a clandestine meeting. On the appointed night, Lucas, Pedro, and Javier arrived early to prepare the space and ensure there were no traps or spies lurking. Gradually, the allies began to arrive. There was an intriguing mix of figures, a former police officer who had investigated strange and inexplicable cases, a medium with extraordinary abilities, and even a history professor specializing in ancient cults. Each had their own stories of encounters with the supernatural and brought something valuable to the table. Lucas took the lead and began explaining everything they had discovered about the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura. The atmosphere grew tenser as he described the macabre rituals, masked killers, and dark entities the cult was trying to summon. The medium, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes, spoke next. "The Hermandad is older than we can imagine," she said, her voice seeming to echo in the room. "They have deep roots in Madrid's history and use places of ancient power for their rituals. If we want to stop them, we need to understand where and how they operate." The former police officer, a robust man with battle scars, added, "There are rumors that the Hermandad is recruiting more members. They're stealthy, infiltrating various parts of society. We need to dismantle this network before it grows any further." The history professor, a thin and scholarly man, brought out old maps and rare books. "There are locations in Madrid that are intrinsically linked to supernatural energy. The sanctuary you found is just one of them. We need to identify all these sites and ensure they aren't used by the Hermandad." The discussion continued, each person contributing their knowledge and experience. The atmosphere was charged with urgency but also determination. They knew they were up against a powerful and ancient force, but they were united by a common purpose. Suddenly, a sound from the warehouse entrance interrupted the meeting. Everyone fell silent, alert. Lucas signaled Pedro to check, and he moved cautiously, weapon in hand. When Pedro opened the door, a figure stumbled inside. It was a young woman with torn clothes and a desperate look. She was injured and seemed exhausted. "Help me," she said before collapsing into Pedro's arms. Immediately, Javier and the medium rushed to assist the young woman, trying to stabilize her and treat her wounds. Meanwhile, Lucas and the former police officer stood guard, on alert for any signs of danger. When the young woman finally regained consciousness, her voice was weak but clear. "They're coming," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "The Hermandad knows you're here. They're going to attack." The news hit the group like a bombshell. They needed to act quickly. Lucas looked at his allies, fear and determination etched on their faces. "We need to prepare," he said, his voice firm. "This might be our last chance to stop them. Let's show the Hermandad that we're not easy prey." With an emerging plan and a sense of urgency, the survivors began to organize, ready to face the imminent threat. Each knew that the fate of Madrid, and perhaps something even greater, was in their hands. The final battle was approaching, and they were determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. Night had fallen heavily over Madrid, and the abandoned warehouse was on high alert. The survivors, now united in a common cause, were preparing for the final confrontation. Lucas, Pedro, Javier, and their new allies had turned the space into an unlikely headquarters, filled with makeshift weapons, protective spells, and strategic maps. The tension was palpable, with every noise and shadow prompting an instant reaction. The young woman who had taken refuge in the warehouse, still shaken, had revealed crucial details about the Hermandad's plans. They were preparing for a coordinated attack, intending to eliminate any threats to their cult and complete the interrupted ritual. Lucas was in charge, reviewing the final details of the plan with Pedro and Javier. The history professor and the medium helped set up defenses and prepare protective rituals. The night was eerily quiet, with the occasional sound of wind and distant footsteps only heightening the sense of impending danger. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the outside. The warehouse door was blown open, and the shadows of the Hermandad members began to infiltrate. The hooded figures advanced, their imposing silhouettes illuminated by the torches they carried. "They've arrived!" Lucas shouted. The survivors braced for the attack. The former police officer, with a determined expression, took up position near the entrance, ready to face any intruder. The medium began chanting protective spells, her words creating a spiritual barrier that seemed to glow on the warehouse walls. Lucas and Pedro fought side by side, each wielding improvised weapons and defending against the relentless attacks of the cult members. The sounds of blows and screams mixed with the noise of explosions and the crackling of flames. In the midst of the chaos, the masked killer emerged from the shadows, his ceremonial dagger gleaming menacingly. Lucas spotted him and immediately confronted him, the tension between them palpable. "You can't escape," the killer said, his voice distorted. "The Hermandad is determined to complete the ritual. And you will be the final sacrifice." Lucas blocked a strike with a swift parry, his heart pounding. He knew he needed to defeat the killer to have any chance of success. The fight between them was brutal, each move calculated and deadly. While Lucas battled the killer, Pedro and the former police officer faced a group of attackers trying to dismantle the warehouse's defenses. The medium continued her chanting, shielding the survivors from the supernatural assault. Suddenly, the young refugee reappeared, this time with a small box she had found in the crypt. With a determined look, she handed the box to Javier, who immediately recognized the item as an ancient protective artifact. This is what we need," Javier said, opening the box and pulling out an old amulet. "It's an artifact that can neutralize the energy of their rituals." With the amulet in hand, Javier and the medium quickly performed a banishment ritual, directing the energy against the invading members of the Hermandad. The light emanating from the amulet was intense, and the cult members began to retreat, their power diminished by the strength of the artifact. At the climax of the battle, Lucas managed to disarm the masked killer and, with a final blow, brought him down. The man fell to the ground, his mask broken, revealing a face twisted in rage and despair. With the killer defeated and the cult members retreating, the battle seemed to be nearing its end. But the air was still charged with tension, and Lucas knew there was one final challenge ahead. The medium, after completing the banishment ritual, looked at Lucas with a grave expression. "They will try one last attack," she said. "Something bigger is approaching." And so, with the survivors exhausted and wounded, the atmosphere of battle was far from over. The fight against the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura was reaching its peak, and the true final confrontation was yet to come. The fate of Madrid and the supernatural forces was about to be decided in a showdown that would require all the courage and strength of those on the front lines. The warehouse was in ruins, the debris and shadows of the battle creating a grim scene. The Hermandad's attack had been fierce, but with the power of the amulet and the bravery of the survivors, they had managed to repel them, at least temporarily. The relief was mixed with a growing tension, as everyone knew the fight was far from over. Lucas, Pedro, Javier, and the others were exhausted and wounded, but they couldn't afford to relax. The battle had shown that the Hermandad was only beginning to reveal its true strength, and the most frightening part was yet to come. As they tended to the injured and reassessed the situation, a strange sound began to manifest. A low, growing murmur, as if something was trying to communicate from beyond. Pedro, with a worried look, pointed to a dark corner of the warehouse where an eerie light seemed to shine. "This doesn't look right," he said, his voice heavy with apprehension. Lucas approached cautiously, followed by the others. The light was intense, almost like a gateway to another dimension. In the center, an old, dusty book lay open on a page emitting a pulsating glow. Javier, with a look of recognition, picked up the book and examined it. "This is the oldest book of the Hermandad," he said, his voice trembling. "It's the Book of Pacts, where the true goals and rituals of the cult are written." The glowing page revealed an intricate drawing, with arcane symbols and a detailed description of the final ritual. Next to the drawing was an inscription, asterisk, "The truth will be revealed in the final hour, when the veil between worlds is lifted." Asterisk. What does this mean? Lucas asked, perplexed. "It means there's something greater and more terrifying behind the Hermandad," Javier replied. "Something beyond simple rituals and sacrifices. They're not just trying to summon an entity, they're trying to open a portal to a dimension where even more powerful entities reside." As Javier spoke, the light in the book began to intensify. The atmosphere in the warehouse grew charged, and a cold wind started to circulate, as if the very space was responding to the presence of the book. "It's not just a ritual," Javier continued, with a look of terror. "It's a summons for forces that should never be awakened. The Hermandad is trying to open a portal to a realm of darkness, and if they succeed, the consequences will be apocalyptic." Suddenly, a tremor shook the warehouse. The floor began to crack, and a fissure appeared in the center of the space, revealing an intense glow that seemed to emanate from an unknown dimension. The fissure grew rapidly, and the shadows began to stretch and distort. Lucas and Pedro exchanged glances, realizing the portal was forming. The truth they were about to face was more terrifying than anything they had imagined. "We need to close this now," Lucas shouted, his voice filled with urgency. With a desperate effort, Javier and the medium began reciting ancient incantations, trying to seal the fissure and prevent the portal from opening fully. The light from the book became almost unbearable, and the shadows around seemed to come to life, writhing and trying to escape the portal. As they battled the growing force, Lucas and Pedro fought off the entities beginning to materialize around the fissure. Each being seemed more horrifying and powerful than the last, their distorted forms reflecting the essence of absolute terror. Finally, with a shout of effort, Javier completed the final incantation. The fissure began to close, and the light from the book faded, leaving only the echo of a final roar from the entities being pulled back to their dimension. The warehouse was silent again, but the cost of the battle was evident. The group was exhausted, and the air was heavy with tension. The portal was closed, but the truth about the Hermandad de la Noche Oscura and the power they had tried to unleash had left an indelible mark on them all. Lucas looked around at his allies, aware that they had avoided a catastrophe but also knowing that the fight against the supernatural was far from over. The city of Madrid still carried the echoes of the battle and the promise of more challenges, and the survivors' journey was far from finished. The truth revealed that night was just the beginning of a new and dark era.